Before we get into this question, I want to spend just a bit of time on the question stem because it's kind of unusual. I'm going to peg this as a PSA question, but technically it does have something that distinguishes it from just a mere PSA. Even though if you apply the PSA methodology, you'll end up at the right answer choice. And the reason is because of, well, first let's just read the question stem. Which one of the following principles underlies the biologist's argument, right? What does it mean for a principle to underlie the argument? Well, one thing that it means for a principle to underlie the argument is that if you take this so-called principle that underlies the argument and you shove it into the argument, then what do you think it's going to do to the argument? It's going to greatly strengthen the argument. And in the way that PSAs do, because if it's a principle that underlies the argument, it's going to strengthen it by strengthening the structural elements of the argument. Okay, so that's why if you just take the PSA approach, technically it's only half the approach, but as far as I've seen on the test, you'll probably get the right answer. The full approach is the other half of what a principle means. Now, the distinction between PSA and principle is that for PSA questions, you can have anything that wasn't even contemplated by the author, right? Just any random claim, statement, principle. As long as it's true, you can shove it into the argument, it'll make it work. In other words, this is why you see PSA questions that tend to be, the right answer tend to be broader, right? Like broader. They're talking about just dogs, and then you get a PSA answer choice or even a sufficient assumption answer choice that talks about all mammals, right? But see, you couldn't really say that because the argument was talking about dogs, that, the principle that underlie the argument was something about all mammals. Maybe it could be something narrower, just about dogs, right? So in other words, the distinction between truly what this question stem is versus just a PSA is that not only does it have to act like a PSA where you take it, you shove it back into the argument, it has to support the argument. You also have to take the stuff in the argument. You have to be able to say that, look, truly this answer choice that I'm picking was contemplated by the argument, is something that in an assumption way was already kind of inside the argument, right? So it has both, the support flows both this way and this way. Okay, so that's a bit complex, and if you want a simpler version of it, just treat this like a PSA question and you'll be fine. So now let's take a look at the stimulus. What I want to do with this stimulus, and this is a really challenging, from a grammatical perspective, it's a really challenging set of claims to evaluate. I want to do the grammar analysis on this, and then on top of that, I want to do the substantive analysis, meaning now that we understand what the grammar is, what is this argument? Does it make sense? What gaps are present in the argument? Both are challenging, which is why this question is really, really tough. I would say it's probably one of the hardest questions on the LSAT. So let's take a look. Biologists as researchers believe. So again, you have, similar to a lot of other questions, right? You have a author reporting to us what other people believe. Other people, researchers, believe that dogs are descendants of domesticated wolves that were bred to be better companions for humans. Fine, that's where dogs came from. You look at a dog. Who's your great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy? Domesticated wolf, right? Where did the domesticated wolf come from? Well, it was bred to be better companions for humans. Fine. It has recently been found that some breeds of dogs are much more closely related genetically to wolves than to most other breeds of dogs. Now, this is the first sentence I want to turn our attention to. Okay, this is statement 1, and in fact, I'm going to call this P1. And I would encourage you to just pause right now and just try to map this out yourself. The clue is that this is a comparative statement. I want to know how you understand this comparative statement. What's being compared to what, on what feature, who, quote unquote, wins. Okay, so here I'm going to do this, right? It has recently been found. So I'm going to just drop all this stuff. It has recently been found that. That's just a chronological stamp, a time stamp on this claim, right? This claim. When did we realize this claim? Recently. Okay, that's all this bit of language is doing. So I'm going to drop that because it's not relevant for the comparison. What's the comparison? Well, where's the noun? Right? Where's the noun in this sentence? Here's the noun. Some breeds of dogs. What are we saying about this noun? Where's the predicate? Are. And you see the comparative action is happening in the predicate. You see what I mean? All of this action, this comparative action, takes place within the predicate. We're saying some breeds of dogs, what about them, are much more closely related genetically to wolves than to most other breeds of dogs. Right there you have the comparison. On the one hand, we are saying how closely related the dogs are to wolves versus, on the other hand, how closely related these dogs are to other dogs. Other dogs. Right? And okay, let me just redraw this so that I don't skip a step. Right? Here's the some breeds of dogs. That's this. That's the subject, right? In the first run through of this, some breeds of dogs are much more closely related genetically to wolves. That's this. We're comparing it to what? See, you have to restart because this part doesn't make sense unless you read it like this. Some breeds of dogs are genetically related to most other breeds of dogs, right? Genetically related to wolves, genetically related to most other breeds. That's why there's two of these twos here, because you have to read it from here again. So that's why the comparison here is how close this dog is related to wolves versus how close is this dog to other breeds of dogs. Now, you might think that what this claim is saying is, oh, you have some dog breed 1, how closely related they are to wolves compared to some dog breed 2. That, oh, look, this dog is genetically much tighter to wolves, much closer to wolves than dog breed 2 is to wolves, which makes sense, right? I mean, you just look at some dogs like a husky, for example, that just looks a lot more like a wolf than a chihuahua does, right? So this may be true in our world, but that's not what this sentence is saying. What this sentence is actually saying is that the, say, husky, right, dog 1, then compared to like dogs 2, 3, 4, the husky is a lot closely related to the wolf than the husky is to the chihuahua. That's the comparison. The husky is similarly more genetically similar to a wolf than it is, the husky is, to a chihuahua. We're not, right? The distinction is that in this version, the true representative version, the right translation of this grammar, we're not concerned with how closely related a chihuahua is to a wolf. Okay, that's the difference. It is really important to get this comparative statement right. That's why I'm spending time on this now, because if you don't get this comparative statement right, then you're pretty much, you might as well just like toss a coin and pick an answer choice, right? Because if you got the answer choice right anyway, it certainly wasn't because of a reproducible, reliable methodology, right? It was because of luck, and luck is not reproducible nor reliable. Okay, so very important. This is the premise claim, right? This here is the premise claim. All right, let's keep going. We get now to the conclusion claim. This shows that is the indicator that this is conclusion. And once again, I'm going to cross out this bit of language, which all it's doing is saying it's labeling this part the conclusion, right? Just like how this bit of language I crossed out because all it was doing was it was giving a timestamp to this part. So, okay, the difficult part is once again comparison. This time, the comparison is a bit different. Once again, I'd encourage you to try this yourself first before you see how it's done. All right, but here's how it's done. Identify the subject. Some dogs. Where's the predicate? Right? Where's the predicate? Here's the predicate. Are descended from, and it goes all the way to the end. Now, you probably notice that there's a that here, right? Which we know what that is, right? That modifies. Okay, you see the same that up here. It modifies. Dogs are descendants of domesticated wolves that wear red hats, right? That were bred to be better companion for whatever. So all of this stuff is actually just modifier of the wolf. Same thing is happening here. All of this stuff, right? All of this stuff here is just a modifier of wolves. Some dogs are descended from a specific kind of wolf. What specific kind of wolf? The kind laid out in the description. That's all the sentence is saying. Some dogs are descended from wolf asterisk. You want to know what's in the box? Open it up, right? Examine the contents of the box. What kind of wolf are you talking about? Wolves that were domesticated much more recently than other what? Than other wolves. Okay, you want to be careful that this other didn't get pushed back over to dogs because that makes no sense, right? Like it really doesn't. One way you can kind of prove this is that the clause that follows that, which is a descriptive clause, you can drop it. You can drop it without affecting the grammatical completeness of the sentence. Like, for example, researchers believe that dogs are descendant of domesticated wolves, period. Right? Okay, what kind of wolves? You open up the box and you start reading everything after that. But by closing the box, you don't end up with some inchoate sentence, right? It's still completely comprehensible what the sentence means. It's grammatically complete. Dogs are descendant of domesticated wolves, full stop. Fine. Open up the box and you realize more about the wolves. Same thing over here. If you think others points back to dogs, that means you think that the bracket here after the that ends over here, right? You think the than others is somehow talking about the subject. First of all, I think you probably already see it doesn't make sense, right? But watch, if you just drop this, try to do that trick again by dropping the stuff, now it really makes no sense. Some dogs are domesticated from wolves than others. Huh? What does that even mean? Some dogs are domesticated from wolves than others, right? Do you see what I mean? It doesn't make any sense. It only makes sense when you push the comparison into the modifier of the wolves, the clause that modifies the wolves, because that's where it belongs, right? Like the comparative action is not even taking place in the main structure of the sentence. The main structure of the sentence is just subject, predicate, that's it. It's in the description of the predicate that we get a comparative, right? It's like, okay, look, you got wolves. I have to kind of draw a timeline here to indicate this. If you want to do this in the versus way, you can as well. We're talking about wolves, right? Wolves 1 versus wolves 2, or two different groups of wolves. And we're talking about which one was domesticated more recently, right? Which one was domesticated more recently. And this part of the sentence tells me that, if I assign this to wolf 1 and this is wolf 2, well, then wolf 1 was domesticated more recently. This group of wolves was domesticated yesterday, right? These wolves, they were domesticated 100,000 years ago, right? That's what this is saying, right? That's the versus way to do it. I think for something like this, because it's about timeline, it's probably more useful to just draw a timeline. If this is today and this is, say, 200,000 years ago, all this is saying is that, look, here was a domestication event, right, of wolves, domestication event of wolves. And then here maybe was another domestication event of wolves. And that's it. Just this is wolf 1, this is wolf 2, right? This is wolf 1, this is wolf 2. In other words, this group of wolves was domesticated more recently on this side of the graph, right? More recently, closer to today, than compared to this set of wolves. That's all there is to it for the conclusion statement. Or sorry, I meant to say for the descriptor part of the wolves part of the full conclusion statement is saying that some group of dogs came from this more recently domesticated cohort of wolves. That's the full conclusion statement. Actually, now that I'm talking about this, I realize this was incomplete. I forgot to make this line longer, right? They're comparing the distance between dogs to wolves versus the same set of dogs to other dogs, right? To most of the other breeds of dogs. And what they're saying is that this line is shorter, this line is longer, meaning this is tighter, a genetic tightness. I think you guys probably got it from the talk of it, but I should fix this. Okay, so it actually looks like this. Fine, so now we have our premise and our conclusion. The premise is, look, you have some set of dogs that are much closely more related to wolves than the same dogs are, and I'm just saying huskies for simplicity, than the husky is to, say, chihuahuas, right? Okay, so now because of this, we're saying, oh, well, it must be that some dogs are descended from a more recently domesticated set of wolves. We know that dogs came from wolves, right? All dogs descended from domesticated wolves. Okay, why? Why should we believe this? Well, this is where, earlier I mentioned that there was a complexity with this question having to do with grammar. Now we get into the complexity of this question having to do with the substantive subject matter. Now, if you are a biology major, if you've studied evolution, I think this makes a lot of sense to you. You can already glean what they're not saying, right? And what they're not saying is that you take this to be the phenomenon. This is how you explain it. This is the hypothesis, right? How do you explain the phenomenon that a husky is genetically more similar to wolves than a husky is to a chihuahua? What the hell's going on, right? They're both dogs, right? This one is a dog and this one is a wolf. How is that possible? What must be happening is that husky broke away from a more recently domesticated cohort of wolves, meaning the suggestion is that Chihuahuas and whatever other breeds of dogs broke away from the wolves a long time ago, which is why you see that their genetic similarity, right? Like, when is the last time they shared a common ancestor? If you look at dog 1 and dog 2, 3, and 4, well, the last time you can trace the common ancestor for them is you got to go back to all the way 100,000 years ago. That's when they last shared a common ancestor. Okay, so negative 100,000 years is how much time their genes have had to move away from each other. Versus now, if you want to talk about the dogs, right? Now, if you want to talk about this group of dog and this group of wolves, when's the last time they shared a common ancestor? Well, right here, right? Which was only, what? Not negative 100,000 years ago, a lot more recently. So these two groups, their genes have had less time to move away from each other. That's the explanation. And if I think, with this, the answer choice is, it's going to be fairly obvious. But without this, right, let's look at the answer choice now. We'll look at answer choice B first, which is the right answer choice. If one breed of dog is more closely related to wolves than to another breed of dog, that's just repetition of the premise, right? Basically, what B is saying is if P, then arrow, what? Something like C. Something like the conclusion. Then that breed of dog has more recent undomesticated wolf ancestors than the latter breed has. Right? Notice, okay, let's just map this on to what we have here. With answer choice B, the claim is that it's supposed to make the premise more supportive of the conclusion in a structural way. You can already kind of see that, right? Because the if-then structure, we know for PSA questions, the structure of the right answer choice is just, typically speaking, P arrow C. You can already see that the P is in the right place. We just need to make sure this actually says C, or something allows us to go to C. One breed of dog more closely related to wolves than that's D1. That's what we call D1. So B is saying, look, D1 over here, right? Dog group 1 over here. If this is true, then the former breed of dog, that's dog group 1, has more recent undomesticated wolf ancestors. And this is where you need to make that connection of, it's not spoken, but, look, domesticated wolves came from where? You don't want to say something like undomesticated bears, right? Like, where do domesticated wolves come from? Undomesticated wolves. Right? That's why they're using this language here to try to get you to make that, or I don't know if they're trying to get you to make that. They may as well be trying to hide that connection. But look, they're saying this former breed of dog has a more recent undomesticated ... trace their great-great-great-granddaddy to domesticated wolf, and then both of them, right? Both of them trace their ancestry to the undomesticated wolf. Whereas, right, dog 1 has a more recent undomesticated than the latter breed. The latter breed is dogs 2, what we call 2, 3, and 4. They can't trace their ancestry here. They have to trace their ancestry to a less recent undomesticated set of wolves. See, if that's true, if B is true, if dog 1 traces his ancestry to a more recent undomesticated wolf population, and dog 2, 3, 4 traces the ancestry to a less recent, further back, undomesticated wolf population, and we know that dogs came from domesticated wolves, then you see the conclusion follows. Then, of course, dog 1 descended from a more recently domesticated wolf population than dog 2. Because we know that all dogs came from domesticated wolf populations. You just told me that this group of dogs, undomesticated wolf ancestors way back over here. This group of dogs, undomesticated wolf ancestors only back over here. And you told me that everything has to be domesticated anyway. So, well, then it must be that at some point you got domesticated right over here. You got domesticated over here, which is what they're saying here in the conclusion that this dog 1 group descended from a more recently domesticated set of wolves. Okay, so one last point about this correct answer choice for PSA questions. Notice how if this were just a simple strengthening question or a weakening question, you bet we'd be a lot more focused on the phenomenon hypothesis framework, which we use so heavily in weakening and strengthening questions. But because this is a PSA question, like the SA questions, you focus on the structural connections. Right, you see how here it's as if P, but not really C here, but something allows you to draw the C from it. Okay, Now let's look at answer choice A. Remember from the theory lessons on PSA questions, I mentioned that a common trap answer choice is an answer choice that is logically wrong, right? PSA questions are structural. You have a premise, you have a conclusion. We're trying to build a bridge from the premise to the conclusion, not from the conclusion to the premise. But that's exactly what answer choice A is doing. Notice the if, the comma, the unspoken then, but the then is here, right? The if then. Notice the if part. What part does it sound like? Does it sound like more like the premise, or does it sound more like the conclusion? It sounds more like the conclusion. One breed of dog descended from wolves that were domesticated more recently than something something. I mean, that's clearly conclusion talk. Premise talk is about how tight the dogs are genetically to the wolves than that dog is to the other dogs, which that actually shows up in the then part. For maybe more closely related wolves than those, but actually not, right? Because this is actually the misrepresentation. This is, remember earlier we talked about this premise and I said they didn't care about how closely related chihuahuas are to wolves? Well, answer choice A cares about how closely related chihuahuas are to wolves. Right? So not only is this structurally premise conclusion flipped around, it also misunderstood the content of the comparison in the premise. So A is all sorts of wrong. Now, I mentioned the structure element because notice I didn't actually spend time parsing out the grammar. You can. This is actually really good practice. You know, if you are particularly weak with grammatical statements, I would recommend you just go through a full prep test of logical reasoning only. Forget the question stem, forget everything else. Just look at everything. Just spot every single word, sentence rather, that contains the word than, and just do a comparative, grammar lesson on it, analysis on it. Just parse out the language, right? You can definitely do that. But here I'm making a different point. The point I'm making is a point about efficiency. If you know and are familiar with the types of trap wrong answer choices, I call them cookie cutter wrong answer choices because they follow a pattern, then you can quickly eliminate wrong answer choices. This is that. This is the one where the premise is, the right answer choice is supposed to be P arrow C, they give you C arrow P. This is wrong each and every time. Let's now look at C. Any breed of dog descended from wolves that were domesticated is more closely related genetically to at least some other breeds of dog than to wolves. So let's parse the sentence out, but first of all, just quickly dispense with it because notice it doesn't hook the premise up to the conclusion, right? In that structural way. It doesn't say if the stuff in the premise is true, then you can arrive at the conclusion statement. Now, what is C saying? Well, it's saying any breed of dog descended from wolves that were domesticated. So D1 is a breed of dog that's descended from domesticated wolves. Fine. So D1, right? What about it? What about it? That's the subject. Here's the predicate. Is more closely related. And here I want you to note the similarity in grammatical structure between answer choice C and the premise. Notice the presence of the double two, right? Over here, double two, following the then, same thing. So how do you read this? We're saying this dog, because you're descended from a domesticated wolf, you're more closely related genetically, at least some other breed of dog than to wolf. So, okay, fine. Here, you're not as closely, you're more closely related to wolves than to dog 2, 3, and 4. But C is saying, okay, but you know how closely related you were to wolves over here? This really tight connection because the wolf is what you descended from. Well, okay, but there is this other breed of dog, let's call it dog breed number 10, that you are even more closely related to, right? This distance is even shorter. So the husky? So yes, the husky is very closely related to wolves, but the husky is even more closely related to the Malamute, right? They're real cousins here. They are like distant cousins. That's all C is saying. Okay, fine, right? We do the grammar analysis. Now, hopefully you can, this is like another reason why the C it doesn't do its job. It doesn't allow us to go from this premise to this conclusion. Answer choice D is kind of a strange answer choice. It's almost, I wonder if the LSAT writers, this is their idea of like playing a joke on us. Let's take a look at what D is saying. If one breed of dog is more closely related to wolves than another breed of dog is, then the former breed of dog is more closely related to wolves than the latter breed of dog. I almost feel like I didn't read this right because it sounds to me like D is saying if X, then X, right? Which is crazy. I mean, of course, if X, then X. Why would you even need to say something like that? If one breed of dog is more closely related to wolves than another breed of dog, then the former breed, the one breed, is more closely related to wolves than the latter breed, than the other breed. Yeah. Okay. This is a self-evident claim. Really no need to make it. It doesn't add anything to the argument. I mean, I suppose if we encounter something weird in the argument, like the premise, let's imagine the premise said X, okay? And then let's imagine the conclusion said X. I guess then you would come up with the SA or PSA answer choice, sufficient assumption or pseudo-sufficient assumption answer choice says X arrow X. I guess I've never seen anything like this, even though I guess this is logically valid. I just can't imagine. I've never seen it on the LSAT. I can't imagine where this would ever actually be the right answer choice. And lastly, E says any two breeds of dog that are more closely related to each other than to wolves, right? Like two breeds of dogs, let's say dog 5 and dog 6, we're saying the distance between them is this short, whereas the distance between them to wolves is like this long, right? That's the any two breed for, and it doesn't have to be particular 5, 6, any two breeds of dogs. You can swap out 5 for 8, 6 for 9, whatever it is, right? Whatever that fits this criteria, that they are more closely related to each other than they are to wolves. What about them, right? So there's the subject. If you are a pair of dogs that meet this criteria, then I want to say this about you. Then both of you are descended from wolves that were domesticated long ago. I don't even know what long ago means. Geez. Because here it was merely a relative, right? Like it was relative, more recently than others. Here it's just absolute, but it's an ambiguous absolute pointer. The hell is long ago? I mean, to me, 1,000 years is a pretty long time ago. So is 100,000 years, right? Like, what are you pointing to? So frustrating, right? I don't know what you're pointing to, but I guess it's not that frustrating because it's not the right answer for its ambiguity, at least. But it's not even clear how, like, what you're talking about. But I think it is an interesting answer choice, again, for grammar analysis, right? If you have trouble with comparative claims, do this grammar, like fully flesh out this grammar. How do we arrive at that, right? First, identify the subject, identify the predicate, put it through this versus comparison, right? And notice that the comparison, this comparative element, is completely contained in the subject of the sentence, right? It's completely contained in the subject of the sentence. We're saying you look at the two breeds of dogs, how closely related they are to each other, how closely related are they to wolves. For only the ones that win over here that are more closely related to each other, that's the ones that we're talking about. Now you go on with the sentence, the predicate. What about them? You're talking about them? What do you want to say about them? Oh, they're both descended from wolves domesticated some ambiguously long time ago.